Morning Coffee Chat friends. Steve here with a few thoughts on a topic I think is important. Well, in the absence of having regular coffee chats, that is, I find myself wanting to have a coffee chat with you, or shall I say within my own head, and put the ideas out there anyway. The topic is going to be kind of surprising maybe, because how does it relate to improving the quality of our life experience? The topic is stupidity. And the reason I think it's important is because I find myself in that situation, the state of stupidity on a fairly regular basis. And I would say that it's not directly related to improving the quality of life experience. However, becoming aware of the tendency to be in that state, and then the effect of that awareness to help myself, ourselves, whatever it is, out of that state of stupidity, definitely, I would say, helps to improve the quality of our life experience. Now, this came about as the result of, I would say, two promoters of an idea being generated, Over the last couple of weeks, I ran across a couple of people who put forth ideas that were very interesting, very educational, yet which instilled in me the importance of being consistent in the way it is that we analyze things, or we look at things, and the way we progress in our growth, our knowledge, our understanding, our goals, our successes, whatever they are, so that we're not caught up in the stupefying situation. I looked up the word stupid actually in terms of its origin, and what it basically boils down to is a breakdown in thought process. So if thought process is important, then when that breaks down, there's going to be trouble. And this happens with me on a regular basis. So I just wanted to put that out there. How can we more consistently keep the thought processes going? The first message that I came across was by a guy called Marcus. He calls himself Marcus on the internet. And he's got a website called servantking.info, I believe. But if you just Google Servant King, you'll find it. The guy has a wonderful message for most of what he has to present. He talks about something called the perfect swindle, which is no surprise to most people who open their mind to see that most messages are just full of crap. In terms of how the world is being run. There's lots of crap in it, and we're being swindled because everybody, so often messages are being put out not for our best interests in mind, but for the best interest of those putting the message out. So the perfect swindle, he does a great job of presenting that. He's very articulate, he's a very good communicator, he's very passionate about what he's doing for sure, and he's got many, many hours of videos and also written up documents that you can read. He also has a really interesting thing in there that was very similar to what I have talked about before. I call it the order of creation. He calls it the serpent move. I think he does that because he's very biblically minded. He follows very much the Bible. He uses terminology of the serpent, Satan, and what have you. He talks about how there's what creates us. He calls that God. And there's man. There's what man creates. And then there's what man becomes subservient to. Man becomes subservient to what he creates. He talks about God, man, government, and then citizens, persons, all these sorts of things. So he talks about man being the creator of government, and then turning around and placing him subservient as a son of government, so per the son of government. So man is then both creator and become subject to through the person he creates to government. And he's just saying this is not necessary, this step is not necessary. In fact, it's a violation of law, he claims, according to his interpretation of law. I thought that was all really, really fantastic. The other interesting thing I learned in this that I didn't realize is that because he talks a lot about the Bible, especially on the later parts of his presentation, I didn't realize that there is no such thing as the Ten Commandments, at least not in the everyday practical sense. I grew up Catholic, and the Ten Commandments that I learned are not the biblical Ten Commandments, or they're not the Ten Commandments of the Protestants. I didn't realize that. The Catholics omitted, at least in their catechism, the second commandment, which is that you're not supposed to have graven images and be an idol worshiper. They eliminated that, and the way they made sure that they could still have 10 commandments, they took the last commandment, the covetous commandment, and they made 2 commandments out of it. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, you shall not covet your neighbor's goods. That doesn't exist in the so-called Protestant or biblical 10 commandments. There's just the covetous one, which includes the wife and his ass and everything else in there that you're not supposed to covet. He puts a lot of focus on this, and this is where the stupidity, or what I would say, stupidity is often seen as kind of a derogatory term, but the suspension of rational consistency, shall we say. This is where he falls down, I would say, and I'm not blaming him specifically. What I'm saying is this is a tendency that we human beings have when we support our way of being, or our way of thinking, is if we are not consistent with ourselves, we can get caught in the trap of speaking the way things should be and then behaving in a different way. Maybe I'm wrong here. Maybe have a look at it and see if you think that that is the case as well. But what I noticed is that he makes great effort to present the idea that we lose our freedoms, we lose our inheritance, if you will, as born free when we create an idol, a graven image. A graven image is something we engrave with our hands or our mentality, something we create. So we create this so-called authority called government, and then subject ourselves to it. So that is a violation of the second commandment, and it's probably why the Catholics removed it, because the Catholics are all about graven images and kissing the feet of statues and all this sort of thing. So it's a lot of the things they're doing. They take a piece of bread, which is supposed to be the ritualistic cannibalism in the church. All of this stuff is graven images. It is all against the second commandment. So to get away with that, they removed the whole commandment and then topped it up with another one at the other end to make sure it was still 10. My guess, once again. But talk about suspension of rational thought. That I missed that all this time. But anyways, stupidity. So he goes to this great extent of making sure that everybody's aware of his stance of not creating idols, of not going towards graven images, and to stay with the basic relationship of creator-created and the servant mentality, the servant way of living in reference to that relationship. Why do I say he falls down? And why do I say this is a tendency for us to do? Well, I even missed it in the first place. The reason I say this is because the Bible itself is a graven image. Now this is, by definition, it is. Now this is going to come across as harsh to some perhaps. But I say this because it is not unlike the sacred holy book, the 8th Guru, I believe, of the Sikhs. The Sikhs, of course, they had Guru Nanak in the beginning, and they had a bunch of subsequent a bunch of subsequent gurus. And then finally they had the final guru, which is a book. And the book is a guru. It is undefilable, the Word of God. And almost all major religions do this. The Muslims are the same. I mean, they came along and they said, yes, there was Abraham and these other guys, and there was Jesus, and then there was Muhammad. But at Muhammad, it's ended. It's done. Except that there's two different kinds of Islam, and one of them has, I'm way off, I should have researched this. One of them has the son, perhaps, of Muhammad, a relative of Muhammad, Ali, I believe his name is. Well, he might actually have some authority in what he's saying. But what the end result, though, is the book, the Quran. And it is the undefilable, undisputable Word of God. And the same thing often happens with the Bible. It is said to be the Word of God. Yet, to my knowledge, everything that's written in there was written by man. That is, by definition, a graven activity. When we engrave something, somebody with their mentality created an idea. It went through their hand, through the chisel or the brush or the pencil, and it created it. It doesn't say in the Bible, the gospel according to God. It says the gospel according to Matthew or Mark or the Acts as written down by Paul, or all these sorts of things, Ecclesiastes. All of these different writings written down have been written by man in the same way that acts and statutes of government are written by government, but somehow then we think that they're higher than us. They think there is some sort of a supremacy, if you will, that they then exist, but they exist in fantasy. They're just somebody's creation. And then we abide by them. They either both are correct, that they are supreme to us, or they're not, right? But in terms of, if we do not suspend our rational mentality, after all, if we think about it, we are created with a rational mentality. Surely that's created for a reason. And if we do not suspend that, and we apply the same rigor to everything across the board, then we cannot hold up the Bible or any other book written by, let's not forget it, man, as some sort of a sacred cow which cannot be debated, and cannot be questioned, cannot be objectively looked at. So, whoever sees this, whoever sees Marcus, I'm not condemning Marcus whatsoever. I'm gratefully thankful for a wonderful message that he has. There's so much information in there, which is of value in terms of us seeing hierarchies and how we are swindled in life. Where I think he falls down, though, is a pitfall that so many of us fall into, which is to preserve the sacred cow and at the same time call our process rational. It's not rational if we're not willing to suspend our belief that something is completely sacred and cannot be questioned. That's number one, Marcus and the Serpent King. The second one is a regular contributor to a newsletter, which I would highly recommend for anybody who's interested in investing or just alternative views on how the world, geopolitics and so on works. The guy's name is Paul Rosenberg, and he contributes to something called the Casey Research Letter. And Paul Rosenberg he writes this letter called A Free Man's Take. And he talks about how this one article that I read, which was once again one of the things that twigged my idea to talk about this this concept called stupidity. He had an article that I read a few days ago. It was called How History Becomes Propaganda. And this related to the whole Bible thing to me a lot, because not that I really learned a whole lot from what Paul Rosenberg had to say, but it was just a reminder of how history, if you think about it, the now is created by history. You know, timelines are like building blocks, if we think about it. Just like building a house, we build the foundation first. So when we're building the first floor or the second floor, the history is that we built the foundation, we dug the hole and this sort of thing, right? So the more accurate we can get our history, a sense of our history, the more accurately we can live our lives out today, right? The thing is, though, that formalized history that is taught is done so through a filter of what is most beneficial to those teaching the history. He uses the example of public schools. Public schools are government run. They have been government run for a very long time. So therefore the history of Canadian history, American history and whatnot is all painted with a brush of making the current regime or the current system look in the best light, and those who are considered enemies to look in the less favorable light. And the reason this related a lot to the whole Bible thing is there's an old saying, you know, the victors write the history books. And if we look at the Bible, especially the New Testament, as a history book of what actually happened, we have to look at least take a little bit of a look at when it was actually written and who put it together. You might ask, well, what's this got to do with the victors? Well, if you do any research, you'll find that there's something called the War of the Jews, which took place shortly after the historical documented time that Jesus was supposed to exist, probably 30 to 50 years afterwards. And in that time, the Romans had had enough of the Jewish problem, if you will, at the time. They were a great threat to the Roman Empire, and they, in that area anyway. So they basically decimated the Jews. There's the old saying, there was not one stone left unturned in the temple. Jerusalem itself was completely destroyed, and the final battle was the Battle of Masada, where the Jews went up on this Mesa tabletop mountain, and rather than be captured, they fought as long as they could, and then they committed suicide. So, and if you can imagine at that time, and it's fairly well documented, that media at that time was centrally controlled. I mean, it's always really centrally controlled when you have a totalitarian or any kind of a central authority. The media that gets out there is centrally controlled. So what happened was that we know this, that the Christianity eventually became the state religion of the Roman Empire. And through that process, the Bible that we know today was created for that religion. Now, who created, under whose sanction was that Bible created? Well, obviously under the Roman sanction. So it's a political book. And to this day, it sits up on the altar of politics, which is every courtroom judge's bench. It sits there as a symbol of authority. I think that's really interesting. And if you take a step back too, who wrote these messages of the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles and all these sorts of things? Well, they were written sometime after the time of Jesus, probably during or after the War of the Jews. So therefore, they would have been written only under Roman sanction. Paul, it is known quite well, was a Roman civil servant. So he wrote a lot of these things, supposedly are under the name of Paul. And then, of course, when everything was compiled, it was compiled by a group of bishops who would only be appointed to that conference with the blessing of the Roman government. All of this, then, when we understand that unless somebody really knows us and they have our best interest at heart, they don't have our best interest at heart. So the Roman government of the time did not, we can be sure, have our, currently today, best interests at heart. Therefore, I think when we use this kind of rigor, and I know I'm not very good at it at all, of breaking things down by always leaving an element of our rationality in the pot, never suspending it, always leaving it there to some extent, because we're created with it. It's like if we're going to walk somewhere, we might as well at least use our legs. That's what they're built for. We might as well leave our rationality in the pot when there's a use for it, so that we don't end up in the tendency to suspend our mentality, which is defined in its etymology as being stupefied or stupid, to fall for ideas that we follow along an irrational bent here, and then all of a sudden we suspend it and say, here's the solution, because this is the undefilable truth, the Word of God. When it was written, very likely, because of the time that it was written, at least we have no evidence otherwise, and put together by a bunch of politicos at the time, and is held up by so many elements of it anyways, as the unquestionable Word of God. But yet, at the same time, it's written by man, and the name of those men is there. Does that make any sense? To sum it up then, I would say that stupidity in and of itself doesn't help to improve the quality of our life experience. However, being aware of our tendency to fall into this trap of suspending our mental faculty and having what's called almost blind faith alone for a document that is written by man or any other creation of man, government agencies, fictions basically, something that somebody creates out of their imagination without any provable substance to it, or any great degree of provable substance to it, or no provable substance to us. If we're willing to accept that, we fall into a stupefied situation. And that is not helpful. But realizing that tendency, we can wake up then and readjust ourselves to be aware of that tendency and then not fall into it so often. Be willing to suspend everything until we check it out and we have some confirmation for ourselves. This goes for everything. People talk about theories of evolution, theories of climate change, theories of socialism, capitalism, all these sorts of things that people put forward. Why do we believe them? We just believe them because it feels good, or millions of other people are believing them. Well, that doesn't make any sense. In fact, probably it's best if maybe stupidity is related to belief, actually. Because if it's just belief without any sort of substance to that belief, then we are for sure suspending our mentality for that moment. And that's the definition of being stupid. I'm guilty of it. I'm not going to say that anybody else has been. I'm just observing things here. And the more we can become aware of our tendencies to fall into such traps, the better off we're going to be, and the better real quality of life we're going to experience. My name is Steve. It's great talking to you. I'll have to do this again soon. Bye-bye for now.